Greetings. Welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Moreau-Seiler, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Scott Weidensaul from Project SNOWstorm will be talking about snowy owls. Before we begin, I'd like to state that we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I would like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. Just a few items before we get going. I'd like to note that PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series is a monthly presentation about anything to do with Native Prairie conservation or species at risk. In March, Jolene Giancity of Environment and Climate Change Canada will present about highly pathogenic avian influenza in wild birds. Our annual Prairie's Got the Goods Week will be taking place from March 6th to 10th, and it's a week-long series of webinars about the ecological goods and services provided by the Native Prairie ecosystem. You can register for these webinars on the PCAP website. A reminder to all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type it into the questions section of the webinar dashboard at any time. You'll be muted for the duration of the webinar. And if you're on a cell phone, you can send your question by chat to the organizer, and questions will be answered towards the end of the webinar. I'd like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our presenting sponsors, Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association, Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, Wildlife Habitat Canada. And in-kind support has been provided by Project SNOWstorm. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our presenter today. Scott Weidensaul is the author of more than 24 books on natural history, including the Pulitzer Prize finalist, Living on the Wind, and his latest, the New York Times bestseller, A World on the Wing. Weidensaul is a contributing editor for Audubon and writes for a variety of other publications, including BWD and Living Bird. He is a fellow of the American Ornithological Society and an active field researcher, studying saw-whet owl migration for more than 2 decades, as well as winter hummingbirds, bird migration in Alaska, and the winter movements of snowy owls through Project SNOWstorm, which he co-founded. He lives in New Hampshire. So, without further ado, I will pass it over.
Well, thank you very much, Caitlin. Appreciate that. we're going to do the little screen share shuffle here, which is always a little bit awkward. So bear with me for just a moment. Caitlin, are you seeing my title slide?
Yes, perfect.
Oh, terrific. And now let's see if it stays there. No, it didn't. This is what we had. This happened to us just a moment ago. Bear with us, folks. Technology. I'm convinced. Do you have the full screen right now?
No, we don't.
Okay, hang on. Let's try it.
Oh, there.
There we do. Okay. I'm convinced the technology reached its peak with the flint spear point 20,000 years ago, and it's been downhill ever since. So anyway, thank you very much for inviting me today. Talking about snowy owls and the work that we've been doing with Project SNOWstorm. I know snowy owls are an integral part of the winter landscape in Saskatchewan on the prairies. I'm up in New England, so I'm coming from a somewhat more of an eastern perspective. But as you're going to hear, the work that we're doing with Project SNOWstorm to learn more about snowy owls includes some tag birds that move through, frequently move through Saskatchewan, and some of them that have wintered there. And there we go. So as you heard in the introduction, I've been a bird nerd my entire life. I grew up in the mountains of eastern Pennsylvania along one of the great eastern hawk migration routes. I started banding raptors like hawks and eagles and falcons back in the 1980s. I've gotten involved over the years with studying the way many species of western hummingbirds are expanding their ranges into the east and the southeast here in the US, many of them coming through in the middle of the winter when you wouldn't think there'd be any hummingbirds around. But for the longest time, if anybody asked me what my favorite bird was, I would have told them it was this one. This is the northern saw-whet owl, about the size of a soda can, just ridiculously cute little, extremely common forest owl found across the entirety of the forested regions of North America. And for years and years, I've been, studying these birds for more than 25 years. We've banded like 13,000 of them in migration. Like I said, if you'd asked me what my favorite bird was, that would have been it. And then 10 years ago, that changed because, my God, look at that bird. There's just something magical about snowy owls. They're huge, they're charismatic, they've got a really almost a magnetic sense about them. Nobody that sees a snowy owl is ambivalent to it. It's pretty much everybody who sees a snowy owl is mesmerized by them. Snowy owls, of course, are an Arctic species. They come south into southern and central Canada and the northern United States at more or less, more or less regular numbers each year. But then periodically they have these big eruptions, these big invasions of snowy owls to the south, and we'll talk about why in just a moment. They're circumpolar birds. They're found at the highest latitudes of North America and Greenland, and across Europe and Asia, from Arctic Scandinavia across the top of Russia and into the Russian Far East. And as you can see there in blue, they move south to a greater or lesser extent each year. Here in North America, it's actually a fairly complex migration system that snowy owls undertake. In fact, one could say that if there is any approach to migration, from not migrating at all to being fairly long distance regular migrants, some snowy owl somewhere takes it. They have a very complex migration system. The area in pink up in the high Arctic is where they're found only during the breeding season, Baffin Island up to Ellesmere Island. The area in purple are where they're found year round. And the area in solid blue, from the prairies around the Great Lakes and down the Ottawa and St. Lawrence River valleys into Atlantic Canada, are where the birds are found regularly in winter. And in fact, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and southern Manitoba and down into Montana and the Dakotas, are an area where snowy owls are found reliably year after year. Now, the numbers change. The intensity of the migration can change dramatically from one year to the next. And then when you have these large invasion years, when snowy owls erupt south, as it's called, they can be found as far south as, well, in some cases, as far south as Florida and Texas, and occasionally out to Bermuda, when you get these really massive years. During the summertime, they're a bird of the high Arctic. This is the Arctic coastal plain in Alaska, a very flat, treeless landscape. And the physical qualities of the Arctic where these birds breed, I think, plays a really significant role in the kind of landscapes that they look for when they come south. These are not birds, obviously, of forested landscapes. And in fact, when snowy owls will show up in the south, they're often extremely naive around people. They don't seem to be bothered by traffic. They don't seem to be bothered by human beings. They don't seem to be bothered by jet planes. And people express wonder at that. And I have to point out to them that to a snowy owl, a tree is every bit as alien as an aircraft is. And so, I'm not sure that they would necessarily be any more frightened of a jet than they would be of seeing a tree for the first time. These birds are back up in the Arctic. Many of them remain there through the winter, but those that migrate south come back very early, long before the snow melts. They nest on the ground because, well, they have no choice, because there's no trees on which to nest. So they often find high hillocks that give them a 360-degree view, so they can see any predators like wolves or foxes coming at them, or grizzly bears. And also that the ground is higher and dries out a little bit more quickly. They'll lay anywhere from a couple of eggs all the way up to 9 or 10, depending on how much food is available for them. And the chicks grow rapidly. And actually, when they're just a little bit beyond this stage, they actually leave the nest and scatter out across the tundra, because, as you can imagine, if you have all of your chicks sitting in one spot in this exposed landscape, they really are exposed to predators, and so they tend to scatter and head out into the tundra. Whether or not they are successful breeding and the number of chicks that they're going to lay depends on lemmings. During the summer, on the breeding grounds in the Arctic, snowy owls are small mammal specialists. They feed on several species of lemmings, voles, occasionally shrews. And because lemming populations in many parts of the Arctic cycle fairly predictably, the number of snowy owls breeding in those areas also rise and fall really dramatically. And so you can see here how closely snowy owl um, breeding activity up in northern Alaska tracks the rise and fall of lemming populations there. That's an area where the lemmings don't really cycle at a very predictable level, but in many parts of the Canadian Arctic and across Eurasia and the Russian Arctic, it's like a metronome. Every 3 to 5 years, you get a peak in lemming populations, and in at those times, the snowy owls will gather there to breed. We have no idea how snowy owls know where the lemmings are breeding, but somehow they do, and they will move, in some cases, thousands of kilometers from one year to the next to move into an area where the lemmings are breeding. Occasionally you get a year like we had this past year where there was almost no sign of snowy owl breeding activity across much of the Canadian and Alaskan Arctic. There just seemed to be no regional lemming peaks last year, and the snowy owls basically took a year off. In the winter, they head south. Not all of them. Some snowy owls will remain in the Arctic for the winter. Some of them actually will move north out onto the sea ice in the Canadian Arctic or off the coast of Alaska, and they'll find sort of permanent openings in the sea ice that are known as polynyas, where the water never freezes. And just in the last 10 or 15 years, we've come to appreciate that in those polynyas, in the depths of the Arctic winter, you have large numbers of sea ducks like eiders and other seabirds. And so these snowy owls that remain in the Arctic through the long dark of the Arctic winter will sit near these polynyas and feed on these sea ducks. But many of the rest come south. And in fact, many adult snowy owls will have traditional territories to which they will return with a fair degree of regularity every year. Some of our tracked snowy owls, we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, come back to, for example, the same stretch of St. Lawrence riverfront in Quebec City, or the same couple of farms in the Ottawa River Valley in southern Ontario. But when they come south, they do tend to gravitate to landscapes that look at least structurally a little bit like home. So as I said, they're not coming into forests. They're looking for wide open farmland. They're looking for beaches and coastlines. They're also looking for airports, because airports often in urban or developed areas are the only large, flat, open areas. And that, as you can imagine, poses a problem both for the aircraft and for the owls. And while in the summertime they feed almost exclusively on small mammals, during the rest of the year, and especially in the winter, they will eat pretty much anything that they can arm wrestle down their throat. I apologize, I know it's lunchtime, but this is a snowy owl that had killed and partially eaten a black duck. They can take really big prey. A female snowy owl can weigh up to about 6 or 6.5 pounds. That's a big bird, but they've been known to take Canada geese, snow geese, great blue herons. But they're also agile enough on the wing. In fact, their hunting behavior is almost, in some ways, more like a falcon than a kind of a wait and see, ambush predator like most owls. They're agile enough to take small songbirds like horned larks and pipits and other small, very agile songbirds. So kind of anything that, as I said, anything that they can catch, they can eat. I've found pellets from snowy owls that contained the entire remains of an adult muskrat that all went down and all came back up again. So how I got into snowy owls actually is the story of the winter of 2013-2014. And I realized that, I'm talking to everybody there on the prairies, but I'm in New England, and at the time I was living in Pennsylvania. And the event that triggered Project SNOWstorm and my involvement with snowy owls was primarily an Eastern Canadian and Northeastern United States Great Lakes event. So what I'm showing you here is a picture of a map from eBird. eBird is the big observational database, birding observational database at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where every year birders send like 100 million of their bird sightings into eBird. And this is showing kind of a typical winter distribution of snowy owls across the Great Lakes and the Northeast in a typical winter, when we have, a couple hundred to 1,000 snowy owls scattered around the Great Lakes through the Ottawa and St. Lawrence River valleys and down along the northeastern coast to about Long Island. That was a typical winter in January of 2013. This, on the other hand, was December of 2013 in what was the largest invasion of snowy owls into eastern and central North America since at least the 1920s and possibly as far back as the 1890s. Almost all of these snowy owls were young birds on their first migration, and they were the result of an enormous breeding event in northern Quebec, up in the Ungava Peninsula, where lemming populations reached a peak that hadn't been seen in more than 50 years. And as I said before, snowy owls somehow, we have no idea how, can figure out where these lemming peaks are. And they gathered in the northern Ungava and neighboring areas, places like Bylot Island and Baffin Island, in huge numbers, and began laying eggs. And what you can see there is 4 eggs and baby snowy owls surrounded by, and feel free to count, 78 dead lemmings and voles. Now, I have shown this picture to people, and the women tend to say, "Oh God, that's such an over exuberant male. This male is bringing in prey even before the chicks are old enough to start to eat, even before the eggs have hatched." But there is a method to his madness. Basically, what he's doing is he's showing his mate that there's no reason to stop at 4. And in fact, in that area that summer, the summer of 2013, many snowy owl nests, instead of having 3 or 4 chicks, had 7, 8, 9 chicks. And there was so much food that virtually all of those chicks survived the fledging, and most of them headed south that winter. Now, interestingly, that particular winter was not an especially good winter for snowy owls in the prairies. This is January of 2013 in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and you can see that there's a few snowy owls around, but it was kind of a bad year. There were relatively few snowy owls breeding in the Western Canadian Arctic that year. For one thing, they may all have been over in the Ungava. And so it was not a big eruption year in that part of their winter range. So when this wall of white birds came roaring down out of the Arctic into southern and into southeastern Canada and the northeastern United States and Great Lakes region, those of us, we didn't see this coming. Those of us who study owls, who study raptors, and we kind of dropped everything that we were doing. My good friend Dave Brinker, who's a biologist with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources and with whom I've been studying saw-whet owls and other raptors for many years, called me up and said, "Look, none of us are going to live long enough to see this again. We need to do everything that we can to get as much information out of this once-in-a-lifetime phenomenon as we possibly could." And so we started making some phone calls. I called my good friend Norman Smith with the Massachusetts Audubon Society. Norman has been studying snowy owls at Logan Airport in Boston since 1981. He's been studying them longer than anybody else in the United States, and actually, to my knowledge, longer than anyone even in Canada. And over the years, he's trapped and relocated hundreds of snowy owls from Logan Airport. We also heard from this fellow. This is Mike Lanzone. He's a golden eagle biologist. He and his wife specialize in studying golden eagles. And he has a company called Cellular Tracking Technologies, based at the time in Pennsylvania, now in New Jersey, that makes the transmitters that they use, that other biologists use for tracking large raptors like eagles. But Mike got his start as a 16-year-old in Rochester, New York, trapping and banding snowy owls. He has a very soft spot for snowy owls. And so we and a number of other colleagues that we were in touch with thought this is a perfect opportunity to start applying this new technology to understanding snowy owls, because snowy owls have been studied extensively in the Arctic on their breeding grounds, but actually very few people have spent a lot of time studying them when they're down on their wintering grounds in places where humans share the landscape with them. So we sent off a proposal to the US Bird Banding Laboratory asking for permission to put these GPS GSM transmitters that Mike's company makes on snowy owls, and we got approval within 20 minutes. Don't let anybody tell you the government can't move quickly when it wants to. As it turns out, the biologists at the banding lab, who work in close partnership with the bird banding office at the Canadian Wildlife Service, by the way, had already been thinking about how this was a perfect opportunity for this kind of a study. So it was just sort of a perfect confluence of all of these things. And so Project SNOWstorm was born. And by the way, the capital letters in SNOW are the 4-letter banding code that bird banders use for snowy owl. The first 2 letters of snowy and the first 2 letters of owl. So it's not just an affectation. So there's a couple of parts to Project SNOWstorm. Those transmitters I talked about have been, kind of the sexiest part. That's the part that gets the most attention. Over the course of the last 10 years, we've tagged 113 snowy owls in 17 states and provinces. We have not tagged any in Saskatchewan. There's actually a number of researchers who have been studying snowy owls in Saskatchewan for quite a few years. Banders like Martin Stoffel and Dan Zelenchuk and Dr. Karen Wiebe at the University of Saskatchewan. They've been doing a lot of their own tagging work. But a number of our tagged snowy owls, as you see in a bit, have of their own volition headed to Saskatchewan, showing thus a great sense of discrimination and taste on their part, I would say. We also collect blood, feather, and DNA samples from the snowy owls that we catch, both the ones that we put transmitters on and others that we just catch and band. And we can use that material for a host of research projects. We can look at the stable chemical isotopes in their feathers and their tissue and their blood, which can tell us where in the Arctic they came from, how their diets changed over time. We've worked with scientists looking at the genetic structure of North America's snowy owl population, showing how dramatically these birds are moving back and forth across large distances. And we're particularly interested in what kind of toxins and environmental contaminants they might be picking up when they come south out of the Arctic, and including what kind of contaminants they're picking up in the Arctic, because of course we know that a lot of contaminants like mercury drift on the air and eventually settle out in the Arctic. And so because of that, we've organized a team of wildlife veterinarians and pathologists that work with state and provincial and federal officials across the eruption zone to salvage as many dead snowy owls as we can find, birds that get hit by cars or electrocuted or hit by planes or whatever, and also to take samples from the live birds that we're catching to try to understand better, the kind of health and toxicology environment that they're living in. Don't expect you to read all these team members here. We work with a lot of people in the U.S. and Canada. The important thing to remember is that pretty much everybody on this list donates their time. Project SNOWstorm is an entirely volunteer operation. The money that we raise goes entirely into either paying lab fees or things like paying for the transmitters and field work that we do. Nobody gets any kind of a stipend. Nobody gets any kind of salary. But we do need to raise money. And from the beginning, the way we have done that is by crowdfunding. And I have to admit that when somebody first suggested that first winter, in the winter of 2013, 2014, when we launched Project SNOWstorm, that we should launch a crowdfunding campaign and ask people to give us money, I said, wait, so you think we should ask strangers to give us money to play with owls, because that's what it's going to look like to people? And they said, yeah, we should. And I have to say, it's been incredibly successful. The contributions we get for US citizens are tax deductible. I realize that's not an option for our many Canadian friends, but for the last 10 years, virtually our entire funding source has come from small donations from folks in North America and increasingly around the world. And we are incredibly grateful for that. This is the heart and soul of what we're doing with a lot of our Project SNOWstorm work. This is one of these GPS GSM transmitters that we're using. They're solar powered, about as big as a matchbox. They weigh about 40 grams or so. And they operate using two technologies that I would imagine most of you have in your pocket right now. They communicate with the GPS satellite system overhead, and they record latitude, longitude, altitude, and flight speed as frequently as every 6 seconds, stored up in their interior memory banks, and then 3 times a week, Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday nights at 7:06 p.m. Eastern Time, they dial up through the cell phone network and they send us all of that data cellularly. I like to joke that my friends are cooler than your friends because I get text messages from snowy owls. Of course, the first thing you have to do is catch the snowy owl, and that can be challenging. They're big, strong birds, and while the young snowy owls in their first migration can be incredibly naive around people, I mean, sometimes you can literally walk up to them. You probably plunk a muskellunge net over them and catch them. The older birds, the adult birds, which are the ones that we prefer to tag because they've got proven survival skills, can be very cagey, very difficult to catch. So we use a variety of techniques. This is a picture of me lugging a lot of trapping equipment, including a spring-loaded bow net out to the New Jersey coast a few years ago, where I was able to I was trying to trap a couple of snowy owls for tagging. We have a variety of traps, but they're all live traps. baited with usually either live Russian hamsters, because Russian hamsters are very cold hardy, that doesn't bother them at all, or pigeon, and whatever lure animal we're using is caged, so there's no way for the owl to get it. We usually what ends up happening is these lure animals become our pets. Once we've got the bird in hand, we take a whole series of standard measurements. We put a federal metal leg band on the bird, the same kind that any bird bander would put on. And then we spend usually about an hour or so fitting the transmitter. This is one of our older style transmitters, fitting the transmitter onto the owl. We're using woven Teflon ribbon, or else a newer material called Spectra that's very low rub, low abrasion, because this goes down under the bird's feathers and right up against its skin. And we're really fussy about how we put these on, because the bird is going to be wearing this for the rest of its life. The transmitter only weighs 2 or 3% of the bird's body weight, so not very much. This is a bird that can eat a third of its weight at a sitting, so we don't think it really bothers the bird at all. And it's sitting right up there in the middle of the back at the center of gravity. We assumed when we started putting these out that since these birds, we know that in the wintertime snowy owls are mostly active at night, even though they're sitting out in the open. But we knew they were sitting out in the open, so we figured perfect application for a solar powered transmitter. What we did not realize is that many snowy owls are like little sunflowers. They sit facing the sun all day long, and as the sun moves, they have a tendency to turn with it, so their back is always in shade. And so we had to make it was a long learning curve. We had to make the solar panels much more efficient to get that low, very low, weak winter sun, especially up in the northern latitudes. But it's worked extremely well. This is one of our snowy owls with a transmitter on the back there, and these transmitters last for years. We have some snowy owls that we've been tracking for 6 or 7 years and gotten terrific information from them. And I think it's fair to say that virtually every snowy owl that we have tagged has surprised us in some way, including the very first one that we put a transmitter on. This is a bird that we tagged on the coast of Maryland at Assateague Island, and it spent much of the winter around Delaware Bay. This is not a seabird, and so we were somewhat surprised to see that most of this bird's activity at night when it was out hunting was out over the open waters of Delaware Bay. I mean, we tend to associate snowy owls with small mammals, like they're lemming hunters, and so we would expect that would be hunting in the tidal marshes back there, which are full of rabbits and cotton rats and voles and all kinds of other furry animals. But instead, this bird was hunting for water birds at night, hunting for ducks and grebes and gulls and small geese out over the open water of the bay. A little bit later in the season, it moved up into Barnegat Bay on the coast of New Jersey. And what I want to point out here, you'll see a couple of different kinds of maps. This is a map. Anything in red is daytime locations or movements. Anything in blue is nighttime locations and movements. And you can see that for the most part, these owls, which have a reputation, I think, unfairly for being active in the daytime, when they're not being disturbed by people or harassed by larger raptors, they mostly just sit still during the day and they do most of their hunting at night. But what caught my attention, if you can see my cursor, is that big blue dot in the middle of the bay. Snowy owls do not float. And so I kept zooming in closer and closer on Google Earth to see what was going on here. And underneath all of those points, there's actually a buoy out there. There's a channel marker. And so what this bird was doing was flying off from its roost on land or in those offshore islands at night, landing on the channel marker and going, okay, let's see, last night I had a scaup for dinner. I think I'll have a bufflehead tonight. We'll pick off a branch or something. And we were actually able to find the pellets these birds were coughing up during their daytime roosts. We knew where these birds were roosting, and able to look at it and see exactly what it was eating. One of the interesting things that we found about snowy owls is how individualistic they are. They really do have quite individual personalities. Some of them wander quite widely. This is another bird we tagged on the coast of Maryland that wandered up through Delaware and into southeastern Pennsylvania, wound up spending a couple of weeks in Amish country in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, the land of horses and buggies, and then wandered back down to the coast. On the other hand, these are the adjacent territories of 2 adult females on the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in the winter of 2016-2017. And each of those territories is about a quarter of a mile wide. So these birds barely budged. And interestingly, they never trespassed on one another. But you know, if your neighbor weighs 6 pounds and has 8 needle-sharp, enormous talons at the end of extremely powerful legs, maybe you don't trespass. In fact, the only time the redbird went through the yellowbird's territory is after the yellowbird left for the spring. One of the things that we've found interesting about snowy owls, and we in the initial years we tagged an awful lot of juvenile birds because that's mostly what was out there. We found that young birds wander a lot during their first winter or two. They can move enormous distances, but once they become adults, they become fairly regular and fairly reliable in returning to at least the same general area each winter. This is a bird that we tagged in the winter of 2018 on Amherst Island, at the eastern end of Lake Ontario on the Canadian side of the lake. And probably she'd been born. She was a juvenile bird. She'd probably been born in the northern Ungava Peninsula up there in northern Quebec earlier that year. Come springtime, though, that's not where she went. She kind of hung a left around James Bay, went up around Hudson Bay, and far up into the central Canadian Arctic, and every year since then came back south into either into Manitoba, Saskatchewan, often dropping south into the Dakotas. One year she spent the winter in just across the Saskatchewan border in northeastern Montana. This was a bird that we called Stella. We nickname these birds based on the locations where they're caught, and she was caught off Stella 40-foot Road on Amherst Island. Unfortunately, we lost Stella last year. She was migrating north through Saskatchewan and had just reached the edge of the boreal forest when her transmitter stopped transmitting. Well, stopped moving. It didn't stop transmitting, but it stopped transmitting detailed location. So we were never able to, get in there to find out what happened because we didn't know exactly where she was. We lost a lot of birds last spring, and very few of our previously tagged birds came south this winter, and we suspect a significant part of that problem may be the highly pathogenic avian influenza that Caitlin mentioned earlier. There's going to be a program on that. We're actually quite concerned about what the impact that HPAI is having on snowy owls and other large raptors. It's cool, though, to be able to follow these birds year to year and see how their behavior and even how their appearance changes. This is a young male snowy owl that was caught that first winter at a small airport outside of Baltimore, Maryland. We banded it. We didn't have a transmitter that was small enough for it. Female snowy owls are significantly larger than male snowy owls, and that's the case with most raptors. They're about 25% larger. So we have a smaller size transmitter that we put on males. We didn't have one that fit him. So we moved him 50 miles west of Baltimore into the farmland of western Maryland and let him go so he wouldn't get killed by a plane at the airport. And the next winter, he came right back to the same airport. By the time we caught him a second time, you can see that he's molted into a much whiter plumage. Snowy owl males have a tendency to get whiter as they get older, and often by the time they're old enough to start breeding at age 4 or 5, we think, we're not really quite sure exactly how old they are at first breeding, they're often pure white. And in fact, it seems like a female snowy owl is not going to pair up with a male unless he is very, very white. This time we did have a transmitter for him. We nicknamed him Baltimore. We released him on the coast of Maryland. He moved north along the New Jersey coast that year, spent the winter up in Great Egg Harbor, and then began to move north from there. He was actually also kind of a surf and turf guy. He was eating water birds occasionally out over open water, but also doing a lot of hunting over the salt marshes. And when we were able to find pellets from him, it was a mix of mammalian and avian prey. In the spring, he started to move north, and as you can see, he went through New York City, and I mean, he went through New York City, right up through the middle of Manhattan, stopped at 2 o'clock in the morning on the top of this 58-story skyscraper next to Madison Square Garden, which is ironically the round building there. This was the view he had from up there. He apparently did not like it. He did not linger, and I can't say I blame him. Moved on north from there and then up into the northern Ungava, where he spent the summer. Now, he was too young to breed that year, and so he spent a lot of the summer moving around. In subsequent years, when he came south, he only came as far south as either Lake Ontario, where he spent the winter 2 years in a row on Amherst Island, and then after that, he stopped a little bit further short in the Ottawa River Valley, just west of Ottawa. And we tracked him for 6 years until his transmitter failed, and then we were actually able to retrap him and take the failed transmitter off. We did not have, unfortunately, we were not able to get permission from the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources to put a new transmitter on him, but we felt good about taking off the transmitter that was no longer doing him or us any good. Occasionally, we get data from these birds that makes us stop and scratch our heads, and this is a good example of that. So these are tracks from a snowy owl that we tagged that very first winter this was in January of 2014 on Lake Erie, just north of the Pennsylvania line. And this was a time when a winter when Lake Erie was almost completely frozen. And what you have to understand when you look at this particular map is all of those little square icons indicate a stationary owl, and they are at half-hour intervals. So this bird was moving at about a quarter mile an hour. And the first time I saw this, I thought, oh my God, he's walking to Canada. But then we thought about it a little bit more, and we started looking at satellite images of Lake Ontario or Lake Erie, and we realized, no, this is what happens when you have an owl that is sitting motionless on a really enormous slab of ice that's miles and miles and miles wide, that's being gently pushed from the southwest to the northeast by a prevailing southerly wind. And you can see how the bird, would sit for a while and then fly a distance, and then sit for a while, fly a distance, and it eventually at one point flew pretty much all the way back to land. This bird spent about 6 weeks at a time out on the frozen surface of Lake Erie, which made us wonder what on earth it was eating out there. Lake Erie was 98.5% frozen that winter, but that also meant that it was 1.5% open. And as these huge ice plates were being pushed around by the wind, it opened up essentially the Lake Erie equivalent of those polynias that we see up in the Arctic. And these birds were this bird and another one that we had tagged that was doing the same thing, were feeding on gulls and loons and ducks and other water birds that remained in those areas of open ice. So in a sense, these young birds in a somewhat more forgiving environment were practicing a lifestyle that some of them might follow in the much less forgiving environment of the Canadian Arctic. We had birds that were wintering in the heart of major metropolitan areas. This is a bird that was trapped at that same small airport outside of Baltimore, Maryland. We put a transmitter on her. We moved her to wonderful farmland in Western Maryland, where she said, and flew immediately back to the heart of Baltimore and spent the rest of the winter in this metropolitan area. And it was actually kind of cool to be able to use Google Street View and go in and see kind of a ground level view of where the owl was. And she loved the roof of this church. I had to wonder and worry about what she was eating in the heart of Baltimore. Poisoned rats, poisoned pigeons, God knows what else. I would not have wanted to be a free-running cat walking down the street at night in that neighborhood, because a snowy owl is more than big enough to tackle a cat, probably at least once. I mean, I can't imagine snowy owl going back for more, because a cat would be a bit to handle, but nevertheless. But the real dangers to snowy owls when they come south basically is us. They're just not programmed for life in landscapes full of people. And particularly in urban environments, snowy owls get into a lot of trouble. I mentioned that we've been doing necropsies and health assessments on snowy owls that have been salvaged. At this point, I think we've probably necropsied something like 450 or 500 snowy owls. And the vast majority of those snowy owls have died from some form of trauma, usually from vehicle collisions or aircraft collisions, because snowy owls are attracted to airports. As I said before, in many areas when snowy owls come south, especially places like Boston, for example, the airport is the only flat, open environment for them. So one of the things that we've done with Project SNOWstorm from the very beginning is work with airport authorities and the wildlife biologists that work either for the airports or for the federal government, that are have the responsibility of trying to keep airplanes and animals apart, to figure out better ways to make airports safer for snowy owls, particularly if we're going to go to the trouble of trapping and relocating snowy owls, which many of these airports do. They have wildlife biologists there, like Jenny Martin at the Philadelphia International Airport. They spend a lot of their time trapping these owls. And often they move these owls and the owls come right back to the airport. So we were interested in putting transmitters on these birds so we could get a better sense of what they're doing, what their movements are after they've been relocated. And is it is there some threshold, some distance threshold beyond which the snowy owls are less likely to return to the airport? What's the sweet spot? You can't spend days and days and days driving these things hundreds of kilometers and releasing them. On the other hand, if there's a difference between 50 kilometers and 100 kilometers, that's probably worth knowing. So this was the first snowy owl actually that I trapped and put a transmitter on. We nicknamed him Philly. It's the Philadelphia airport. We moved him 50 miles west to Amish country in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where there were many snowy owls wintering. It's great snowy owl habitat. And the little bugger went right back to the airport. Within 2 days, he was back at the airport, and he spent the rest of the winter over the next month or so at the airport. Now, it was interesting. The Philadelphia airport is right on the Schuylkill River, which is full of water birds. He never, ever hunted out over the water of the river. He never, to our knowledge, ever took a water bird. Instead, at dusk, he would take off and fly over the airport buildings and out to Interstate 95, and he would hunt for rats and mice and rabbits in the median of the highway. Scared me to death. Thought he was going to die on the highway, but I should have been more concerned about planes, because one morning, just at daybreak, he flew across the runway as a cargo jet was taking off. He was struck. He was killed. Broke almost every bone in his body. But it didn't bring down the plane, which is a significant concern. If you're sitting back in row 36 on the 915 to Toronto, and a snowy owl comes crashing through the windscreen into your pilot's face, that's going to ruin your day. So, the safety issue of these birds at airports is a pretty significant one. I mentioned as well that we have. I'll go back one just to close the loop on this. Just last year, we published a paper in the Journal of Wildlife Management analyzing the results of relocating 42 snowy owls at 13 airports in the U.S. and Canada over the course of the years to look at best practices, basically what the best distance, it turns out if you can hold the owl for 24 to 48 hours and feed it before you release it, it reduces the chances of that bird coming back to the airport. And we're moving into some new areas of research now to try to fine tune those recommendations for airport managers. I mentioned we have a terrific team of wildlife veterinarians and pathologists headed by Dr. Cindy Driscoll on the left there with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, Dr. Cheryl Davidson in the middle from the University of Pennsylvania, and Dr. Erica Miller from the University of Pennsylvania. Again, entirely volunteer. They have necropsied, as I said, hundreds and hundreds of snowy owls that have been sent to them from as far away as British Columbia. And once they're finished doing the necropsy, all of those snowy owl specimens then go to museums like the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, where they're prepared as museum specimens. We want to try to get as much scientific information from these birds as possible. This is the part of the job that most people find a little bit squeamish, a little bit icky, but it's really important. One of the things that we have found, which did not surprise us, is the degree to which snowy owls are being exposed to rodenticides, to rat poisons. Virtually every snowy owl that we catch has some amount of rodenticide in its system, and rodenticides in high enough doses obviously can kill the birds. They're anticoagulants, and they will, a lot of the new generation, like what are known as second or third generation warfarins, are, not just secondary poisons in that if an animal eats the poisoned rat, they die, but even if that animal's carcass is scavenged by another animal, the third animal might die. So I mean, this is potent stuff that has had a real impact on raptors. We've also found that many of these birds are carrying very high levels of methylmercury in their system. Mercury is an air pollutant that's generated by coal-fired power plants, automobile exhaust, gold mining generates methylmercury. It gets into, when it precipitates out of the air, it gets into aquatic systems, and it bioaccumulates, meaning that at every step of the food chain, higher and higher as you go in the food chain, as with DDT back in the bad old days, the level of mercury increases. And so when you get a top level predator like a snowy owl that's at the end of a fairly long food chain, especially a snowy owl that is eating water birds like loons and grebes that have been, and fish-eating ducks like mergansers that have been at the end of a very long aquatic food chain, they can have very high levels of mercury. Mercury can interfere with their reproduction. It can also cause behavioral problems. You know, the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland was mad because hat makers suffered from mercury poisoning. And one of the things that we're looking at now is whether a lot of these snowy owls that are coming in with injuries that have been hit by cars or flown into electrical lines or whatever, if they are behaviorally compromised because they're suffering from mercury poisoning. These birds start moving north in here in the east. It's usually March and April when they begin moving north. It's a little bit later in the prairies because they're farther north to start with. Because our transmitters communicate with us through the cell phone network, once they get out of the northern US and southern Canada, they're out of cell phone range pretty quickly and we lose track of them. But the great thing is those transmitters continue to log GPS locations at a regular basis. They store them in their data banks, and when that bird comes south, even if it's several years later, when they get within cell range and they can connect to a cell phone tower, we get all of that data. And that usually starts happening for us in November, early December. Some of the laggards don't come south until about New Year's. And I got to tell you, it's like Christmas when that happens, because you know, we'll get like 13,000 GPS points showing us in extraordinary detail where that bird went up in the Arctic, up in the Canadian Arctic, what it was doing. We can tell whether it was nesting or not by its movement patterns. You can see, you know, many of the birds that we have tagged in the Dakotas are the ones that are moving north up into the western, you know, the Boothia Peninsula, and up into places like King William Island in the central and western Canadian Arctic. But even many of the birds that are tagged in the east and the Great Lakes make that loop around as well. And they shift dramatically from one year to the next. We've had birds that one year were nesting in the northern Ungava Peninsula in Quebec, and the next year were nesting as far to the northwest in the Canadian Arctic as it's possible to go, where like the next stop is Russia. And if you put all of that together, this is a map showing all of the movement patterns from all of the 100+ snowy owls that we've tagged over the years. Now, as I say, there's, you know, we're somewhat weak in the number of birds moving out of the Canadian prairies. We haven't specifically tagged there because we do have colleagues like Karen Wiebe at University of Saskatchewan that have been doing that work for a number of years. What I find interesting is this, if you can see my cursor, this big hole here in Western Ontario in the boreal forest. That is terra incognita for a snowy owl. They want to move, they move through the boreal forest as rapidly as they can because that is an alien habitat for them. And you can actually see that a couple of these were young snowy owls making their first migration north. They just kind of plowed right into that forest and they didn't come out the other side. Forests are dangerous places for snowy owls. That's just not that is not their thing. I want to leave you here with one last snowy owl track, just to show you the kind of crazy stuff that happens sometimes. This is a bird that we tagged. This is actually one of those birds that was out on the ice on Lake Erie in Pennsylvania. And that spring, it moved north to Hudson Bay, and actually went out onto Hudson Bay and did that. And I have to tell you, when I first saw that, my colleagues and I were kind of baffled. We thought maybe this was a bird having a bad acid trip, or I don't know. We had a hard time explaining that until we realized that this is what you get when a bird is riding on an iceberg in Hudson Bay. And again, I'm hoping you can see my cursor down here at the bottom, but this big curving loop is, whoops, I'm sorry. Let me just go back to that one. This big curving loop is what happens when the wind and the tide are going in the same direction, and then the tide turns against the wind and it doesn't go so far, and then the wind and the tide in the same direction, and then the wind and the tide change a bit, and then the wind blows out of the south and then out of the west, and then the owl says, "The hell with that," and flies back to land again. It has been, I got to say, it's been a blast doing this. We're in our 10th year now. We want to keep. I'm going to keep doing this until they put me in a box in the ground, because snowy owls are just such amazing birds. If you're interested in what we're doing and you want to learn more, grab a screenshot right now so you get that web address, www.projectsnowstorm.org. All of the tracking data for all of the owls that we have tagged over the years is available at our website. We're tracking 5 snowy owls this winter actively, 3 new birds that we tagged this winter in North Dakota and Southern Ontario, and a couple of returning birds from previous years. One is in southern Manitoba near Carmen, southwest of Winnipeg, and the other is in southeastern Ontario, very close to the Quebec border, just west of Montreal. Normally, in a typical year, we would have expected 7, 8, 9 of our previous birds to come south. We suspect we lost an awful lot because of avian influenza. You know, it was a very disappointing year to only have 2 of our veteran tagged birds come back. But you know, we're hoping that the information that we're getting from this will help wildlife managers understand the impact that highly pathogenic avian influenza is having on raptors like snowy owls. So listen, with that, I'm going to stop my screen share, and we've got a couple of minutes here, and happy to answer any questions anybody has. And I hope everybody enjoyed that. I'm also going to take a drink of water. So.
Sure, take your time. First of all, thank you so much for the awesome presentation. Throughout it, people were writing in, wow, this was fantastic. And I do want to let everyone know that we are recording it. So if you know of someone who would really enjoy it and they couldn't make it today, it'll be on PCAP's YouTube channel either this evening or tomorrow, kind of as fast as my internet in rural Saskatchewan will allow. So it'll be up shortly.
If you don't mind, I may share that link as well with on Project SNOWstorm.
Yes, absolutely. So we have quite a few questions that are coming in already, and we'll just try to go with the flow and see how many we can answer. So the first question is, what should somebody do if they come across a dead snowy owl?
So I would let your provincial wildlife folks know about it. We have not been getting, so far as I know, we have not been getting specimens coming in from Saskatchewan because I believe they're being handled within province. But yes, I mean, if you find a snowy owl, don't let that go to waste. You know, contact the I would imagine it's the provincial ministry. You know, if there's a local wildlife official, you know, let them know about it. And you know, it's and always and you can't really tell looking at the legs. Feel the leg to see if there's a band on there. Their feathers are so thick, the bands kind of disappear under the feathers. If there is a band, because a lot of snowy owls have been banded in the prairie provinces, so there's a decent chance that bird might have a band on it. You can report that band number to the bird banding office of the Canadian Wildlife Service, and they will, you know, they'll tell you who banded it, where, you know, how old it is, all that good stuff. The bander gets that information as well. It's a way to connect the dots, and you know, a lot of what we know about wild birds, of course, comes from bird banding.
Okay,
you know,
that is good to know. You know, my instinct would not be to feel a dead bird's leg for a band, but
oh, don't be squeamish. Not gonna hurt you. And frankly, you know, the diseases of birds are generally not the diseases of people. So just wash your hands afterwards.
That's good to know. Um, and the listener named Stacy is wondering if you have any evidence of American snowy owls crossing over the pole and heading into Russia or Europe.
So not crossing over the poles, but and I don't know about Canadian snowy owls moving into Russia. I know that there's Denver Holt, who's been studying snowy owls in northern Alaska. Some of Denver's birds have moved across the Bering Strait into the Russian Far East to places like Wrangel Island. And we know that the snowy owls from eastern and central Canadian Arctic will frequently move over to Greenland. So, you know, some of the work that, like for example, Laval University has been working on Bylot Island for decades, studying snowy owls and other Arctic species, and doing a lot of satellite transmitting of the breeding birds up there. And many of those birds have shifted, as I said, you know, thousands of kilometers from one breeding season to the next. It's really quite extraordinary. Now, the interesting thing here is we did not know, we in the scientific community did not know until maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago, the extent to which snowy owls shift from one breeding season to the next. So if you go back and look at the, you know, any time in the last 20 years, the global population assessment for snowy owls was about 300,000 snowy owls worldwide. And that estimate came from just counting up the maximum number of snowy owls in Alaska, the maximum number of snowy owls in this part of the Canadian Arctic and that part of the Canadian Arctic, and the number in Greenland and the number in Scandinavia, and just adding them all together. Well, except it's often the same owls in Canada and Greenland, or Alaska and Russia. And so we realized that we've been badly overestimating and double counting or triple counting these snowy owls. So the global population is probably closer to about 30,000 rather than 300,000. That's often been portrayed as a population decline. We don't actually know if snowy owl populations are increasing, decreasing, or stable. One of my colleagues with Project SNOWstorm, Dr. Rebecca McCabe at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary in Pennsylvania, we are helping to fund a global population assessment that Becca is doing, working with snowy owl experts all over the world to try to determine where and to what extent snowy owl populations are changing in different parts of their range. Some parts of their range, like northern Scandinavia, their numbers have certainly decreased. That seems to be the case in some parts of Russia. Interestingly, the central and eastern Canadian Arctic is one area where conditions for lemmings and snowy owls may actually be improving because of climate change. In some parts of the Canadian Arctic, late winter and early spring has gotten colder and snowier, which is better for the lemmings. And so there's some indication that snowy owl populations in those areas may actually be increasing. But I shouldn't say too much until Becca actually has run all the numbers and drawn her conclusions.
Perfect, thanks. And a few people have written in to say that if somebody does find a dead snowy owl, that they can report it to the Royal Saskatchewan Museum or Fish and Wildlife Regional Biologist. So a few people wrote about that. So I just want to follow up to that.
This is what happens when you talk to an American.
So our next question, has isotope analysis of tagged birds shown that juveniles generally return to the location where they were hatched? Is there any loyalty there?
So we can't tell that specifically from the isotopes, but probably not. We've seen, because we've put tags on these birds, like for example that snowy owl that I mentioned that was tagged in Ontario and then looped around and went all the way up into the central Canadian Arctic. In that bird that year, there was a major breeding event in the Ungava and virtually no snowy owl breeding that we were aware of anywhere else in the Canadian Arctic that year. That bird undoubtedly came out of the Ungava, and she didn't go back. She hung a left and headed way up into the center of the Canadian Arctic. So there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of site fidelity on the part of snowy owls as in terms of returning to their breeding grounds. And that makes sense, because if there's a big breeding event in a place like the Ungava this year, that's because there was a lemming peak. Well, the lemming population then collapses. And so chances are there's probably not that much food for them there. So this habit of not going back to the same place year after year in the breeding grounds is probably a really good survival strategy for a bird that depends on these really ephemeral and constantly shifting food resources in the Arctic.
That makes sense. For sure, thanks. Do owls pick at the transmitters when they're preening? Do you have any evidence of that?
Yeah, they do. And that's why we use that braided Teflon inspector, because it's really, really tough stuff. In fact, it's very difficult to cut even with a pair of really sharp scissors. We make them as comfortable as possible for them. And what we've seen, and we often have a chance to watch these birds, for days and weeks after they've been tagged, because we know where they are, is that they fuss with it a little bit and then not so much. They just kind of, after a while, they just seem to accept it. We've retrapped these birds many times in subsequent years. We've had an opportunity to, check the transmitter, check underneath the transmitter. There's neoprene on the bottom of the transmitter, so it's nice and soft. Also, that's provides some insulation in really cold weather, and we've never seen any sign of any kind of issues. The folks at Laval University did a really interesting study some years ago on the breeding grounds, where they compared the survival rate and productivity, meaning how many chicks birds with transmitters versus birds without transmitters had. So these owls were all banded. Some of them had
Mhm.
transmitters, some of them didn't. The birds that there was no difference in the annual survival rate of the birds with or without transmitters. They survived at the same rate, but there was a small but statistically significant increase in productivity among the birds with transmitters, which they called the bling effect. I don't think that the owls were
Oh,
really saying, "I think you're sexier because you've got a transmitter," but the birds with transmitters actually were having, slightly more babies on average than the ones without.
okay. Oh, that's
And
very
I don't have an
interesting.
explanation for it.
Other than the blade effect.
Yep, yep.
What would be the cost of a transmitter?
So the great thing about electronics is the costs always come down. When we started doing this project, the transmitters, the retail cost of the transmitters were $3,000 US. We were getting them at cost from Cellular Tracking Technologies, which has been a terrific partner from the beginning. So we weren't paying that much. But the retail cost of those has now dropped to about $1,000 US. So they've gotten
Okay.
lighter, they've gotten stronger, and they've gotten somewhat cheaper.
Okay. Um, do snowy owls mate for life, or do they find a new mate every year?
Every year. Yeah, there's no mate fidelity, along with no site fidelity, which again makes sense because the only way you could find your mate again is if you come back to the same place, and
Mhm.
that place is probably not going to be a good spot 2 years in a row. So they just, it's not quite wham bam thank you ma'am, but it's a little bit like that. They are sequentially monogamous because a lot of birds,
Okay.
a lot of songbirds, they're fooling around constantly. These
Oh
two are
yeah.
mating. He's going off and mating with four more females, and she's going off and copulating with a couple more males. Owls don't do that. Snowy owls do not do that. And we know that because people like Denver Holt have looked at the genetics of the owls, the chicks in the nest, and compared it to the adults, and that's dad in every one of those cases. So in that
Awesome.
in that sense, they are good family values birds.
Yeah. We've got lots of questions left. Do you have an extra 3 minutes by
Heck,
chance?
I do, absolutely do.
Okay. Okay, awesome. You mentioned that males get lighter with age, and females apparently select for lighter males. Do females also lighten with age?
Interesting. If you ask most bird watchers, they will tell you yes. In fact, they will tell you that males always get white with age, which is not true. Some of them don't. Some snowy owls will get darker with age. Some will get lighter. Some of them will darken for a few years and then lighten for a few years. There's a lot of variation there. It's actually very difficult to age and sex snowy owls in the field. Um, bird watchers fool themselves into thinking that they can do this easily, and frequently until you've got the bird in the hand, it's almost impossible.
Okay, that's good to know. Um, have you noticed that there are very low numbers of snowies this year?
Yeah, yeah. This is a very poor year for snowy owls in the East and the Great Lakes. It's
Mhm.
in fact, it's probably the lowest year since the winter of 2010, 2011. And that's because we were unaware of any significant breeding event in the Canadian Arctic this year. It was a little bit, apparently at the tip of Ellesmere Island, they had a little bit of breeding activity, but in all the places that are monitored, and of course, the Arctic is huge, and there's a lot of places where there are very few people, and certainly not a lot of people paying attention to snowy owls. But um, our network of colleagues in the north, they just were not able to find any. Interestingly, in northern Alaska, up at what used to be called Barrowan, whose Inupiat name I can never remember off the top of my head. Denver Holt had more than 50 snowy owls on territory this year, 50 males that were displaying, and yet only one nest out of all of those owls, only one successful nest this year. And he wasn't really quite sure what happened. The lemming numbers looked to be pretty good, but the owls just, for whatever reason, didn't breed. So
Mhm.
it was an odd year this year. I don't think it doesn't. I'm not particularly worried. This happens sometimes. We had
Yeah.
a really low year in 2010, 2013. All hell broke loose, and we had record numbers of snowies. So I mean, I suspect that may happen again.
Yeah. Do you think it has anything to do with avian influenza?
Well, it might. I mean, and that's one of the concerns that
Yeah.
you get a double tap where you have a year where there's very little breeding activity, and of course the population is going to go down anyway because of attrition, and you don't have a lot of young birds coming into the population. And then if you've got something like avian influenza, that takes out a lot of, particularly a lot of mature adults. I mean, a lot of the birds that did not, tag birds that did not come back this year, were adult birds, birds that we'd been tracking, in some cases for 6 or 7 years. And
Mhm.
it's worrisome. We had a number of birds that died on the northbound migration last year. Uh, yeah, it's just, and unfortunately, many of those birds, for a variety of reasons, we were not able to get people into the field to recover the carcass to find out, was it predated by an eagle? Did it fly into electrical lines? Whatever
Mhm.
the issue might have been. So yeah, we're just gonna have to wait and see, but we're certainly concerned.
Okay, that's good to know. Um, One person's wondering if there are any partnership opportunities for trapping and tagging snowies, or if there are any volunteer opportunities with Project Snowstorm.
Well, not with us. We're often
Okay.
working in places like airports where
Mm.
access for understandable reasons is a bit tricky.
Yeah.
And trapping snowy owls, trapping large raptors is a very specialized um, activity. So, we've tended to work with highly experienced, established raptor biologists and raptor researchers. And again, everybody's volunteering their time. For example, one of the two of the birds that we have tagged this year in southern Ontario were tagged by Charlotte England and Malcolm Wilson with the Simcoe Raptor Research Group. They've been banding for many, many, many years. They have a lot of experience, but we had to do specialized training on how to fit these birds with the types of harnesses that we use, the techniques that we use. Kind of sign off on that. So that was a long multi-year process to get them to that point, even though they have a lot of experience trapping snowy owls.
Okay.
We are very careful about who we work with because we're a very public-facing operation, and we want to make sure that everything that's being done in Project Snowstorm's name is being done at the highest level.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think we're going to call it there. There's still questions coming in. We could probably keep you here all afternoon, but
Well,
I
thank
just
you.
want to thank you. Yeah, it's like the amount of feedback that we've had about how fascinating and amazing this presentation is. I can't reiterate it enough. So thank you
Well,
so much. We really
well,
appreciate it,
thank you.
Scott.
Thank you, and I hope everybody just keeps up with what we're doing on Project Snowstorm because, as I say, our birds are showing up in Saskatchewan from time to time as well, and
Yeah.
even though we're not actively tagging there, we've got some pretty significant connections. So thank you very much
Yeah.
for having me. It's been a real pleasure, Caitlin.
Absolutely. Absolutely. To our attendees out there, thanks for catching today's webinar. I also want to put a pitch out. Project Snowstorm has a GoFundMe page, so if you feel inspired, feel free to check that out. I'm also partway through one of Scott's best-selling books, A World on the Wing, and I highly recommend it. I'm looking forward to doing Living on the Wind too, so I do audiobooks because I like movement while I'm reading, but whichever way, it's available in either form. So I just want to put a pitch out for that. So definitely check it out. I also want to let everyone know too that we have our presentation coming up about the highly pathogenic avian influenza. You can register for that on the PCAP website. And then we also have our annual Prairie's Got the Goods Week coming up in March. So thank you very much, everyone. And when you leave today's presentation, there'll be a quick 1-minute survey. If you don't mind filling it out, we really, really appreciate it. And we can report back to our funders and keep our speaker series going to the future and keep spreading the word about all these amazing species that we learn about every month. So yeah, thank you.
All right. Thanks.
Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.
Bye bye.